Have you ever realized that silence can speak louder than words? My grandfather returned from Vietnam in 1971 with a Purple Heart, shrapnel embedded in his left shoulder, and a silence that would define our relationship for decades. As a child, I saw his quietness as a wall between us. The way he'd stare into the distance during family gatherings, how he'd sit alone on the porch watching sunsets, the slight tremor in his hands when fireworks exploded on the 4th of July. I mistook his silence for absence, his restraint for indifference. I wanted war stories like my friends' grandfathers told, tales of heroism and adventure, medals earned and battles won. But my grandfather's lips remained sealed on the subject, no matter how often I asked. It wasn't until years after his death, when I found a small weathered box hidden in his attic, that I finally understood the eloquence of his silence and the profound wisdom it had been teaching me all along. The small town of Oak Ridge, Pennsylvania treated my grandfather, Thomas Miller, like a quiet legend. People would nod respectfully when he walked into the diner for his Saturday morning coffee. Younger veterans would occasionally approach him, exchange a few words, and walk away looking somehow lighter. But to me, his only granddaughter, he was simply Grandpa Tom, the tall, weathered man who taught me to fish, who could fix anything with his worn leather toolbox, and who never raised his voice, even when I accidentally scratched his cherished Chevy pickup. He lived in the same modest 2-story house he'd bought upon returning from Vietnam, where he'd raised my mother and her brother and where I spent countless weekends after my parents' divorce. The house smelled perpetually of coffee, Old Spice, and the faint sweetness of the pipe he occasionally smoked on special occasions. My grandfather's routines were as predictable as the seasons. Up at dawn regardless of the day, newspaper with breakfast, work in the garden or garage, and always, as evening approached, sitting on the east-facing porch in a wooden rocking chair my grandmother had painted blue before she passed. I was 26 when he died, a peaceful death in his sleep after a quiet battle with cancer. He'd kept largely to himself. No fuss, he had insisted when the diagnosis came. True to form, even in death, he chose simplicity. A military service at the local cemetery, his casket draped with the American flag that now sits folded in a triangular case on my mantel. It was while cleaning out his house that I discovered what he had never put into words, and began to understand the profound language of his slints. The attic of my grandfather's house was immaculately organized, unlike the chaotic storage spaces in most homes. Cardboard boxes lined the walls, each labeled in his precise block handwriting: Christmas, Sarah's school, home repair. My mother and uncle had taken what they wanted: photograph albums, my grandmother's china, the antique fishing rods, leaving me to sort through the remaining items before the house would be sold. Near the back, partially hidden behind a stack of National Geographic magazines dating back to the 1970s, I found a box that wasn't labeled. Made of dark wood with brass hinges, it looked like something that might hold cigars or playing cards. It was locked, but the small key was taped to the bottom, typical of my grandfather's practical nature. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded green fabric that I recognized as the same material as his old service uniform, lay his dog tags on their ball chain tarnished with age. Beside them, a Purple Heart in its case, several other medals I couldn't identify, and a combat knife with a worn handle. Beneath these items was a yellowed photograph of 5 young men in jungle fatigues, arms around each other's shoulders, standing before a military helicopter. My grandfather was on the far right, barely recognizable, thinner with a full head of dark hair instead of the silver crew cut I had known, but with the same steady gaze. On the back of the photograph, written in faded ink, Quang Tri Province, 1970. Matthews, DeCarlo, Johnson, Winters, Miller. The only ones left. There was no explanation of what that meant, who hadn't been left, or why these 5 had survived when others hadn't. Deeper in the box, I found a folded letter on onion skin paper, the kind used for overseas mail during that era. It was addressed to my grandmother, dated 3 weeks before my grandfather's tour ended. The handwriting was different from what I knew, more hurried, less controlled, but undeniably his. "My dearest Ellen," it began. "Another man from our unit died yesterday. 22 years old. Had a girlfriend back in Ohio who'll get the news soon. I keep thinking about what she'll never know about him. How he shared his rations with the local kids, how he could mimic any bird call in the jungle, how he kept our spirits up with his terrible jokes." I paused, realizing I was reading something deeply private, something my grandfather had perhaps never intended anyone to see, but I continued, drawn by this rare glimpse into his thoughts. "If something happens to me, there are things I hope you'll never know. The things we've seen, the things we've had to do, they don't belong in our home, in the life we're going to build. If I make it back, I want to leave this all behind. I want to be a husband who loves you completely, a father who isn't haunted, a man who can sleep through the night without seeing faces of the dead." Tears blurred my vision as I read on. "I've decided something, Ellen. If I survive this place, I won't bring the war home with me. I won't burden you or our children with these memories. Some men will need to talk about it, to process what they've experienced. I respect that. But for me, silence is the only way I can ensure that Vietnam doesn't take anything more from me, from us, than it already has." The letter continued for another page, filled with hopes for their future and practical concerns about the house they were planning to buy. But it was those earlier words that echoed in my mind as I carefully replaced everything in the box. My grandfather had kept his promise. He had never spoken of the war. But now I wondered, at what cost had he maintained that silence? And what had I missed by failing to understand it? Growing up, I had interpreted my grandfather's silence about Vietnam as a gap in our relationship, an entire chapter of his life deliberately kept from me. I'd tried countless times to breach that wall of quiet, especially during middle school when we were studying American history. "Grandpa, did you ever see combat?" I'd asked one afternoon while he taught me how to change the oil in his truck. He'd paused, wiped his hands on a rag, and replied simply, "Yes." Then he'd pointed to the oil filter and continued the lesson as if the question had been about car maintenance. Another time, after a Memorial Day parade where he'd stood solemnly as other veterans marched, I'd pressed harder. "Why don't you ever talk about what happened over there? Don't you want people to know you're a hero?" His response had been gentle but firm. "The real heroes didn't come home, Sarah. And sometimes remembering doesn't help anyone." I had sulked, feeling shut out and unimportant. My friends' grandfathers told war stories, embellished over the years perhaps, but shared nonetheless. They displayed their medals, joined veterans of foreign wars chapters, attended reunions. My grandfather did none of these things. His medals stayed hidden. He never went to reunions. The only acknowledgement of his service was the small Marine Corps emblem on the back window of his truck, and his habit of standing, hand over heart, whenever the national anthem played. Now, sitting in his attic with the evidence of his experience literally in my hands, I began to see these memories differently. I recalled how he would sometimes wake before dawn and sit on the porch until sunrise, a cup of coffee growing cold beside him. How he would place his hand on my shoulder when I was upset, not offering advice or platitudes, just his steady presence. How he had taught me to fish with endless patience, never raising his voice when I tangled the line or scared away the trout. I remembered the summer when I was 14 and suffering my first heartbreak. I had fled to his house, embarrassed by my tears but needing somewhere to escape my mother's well-meaning questions. He had simply handed me a hammer and pointed to a section of fence that needed repairing. We had worked side by side for hours, not speaking of my pain but somehow alleviating it through shared purpose and physical labor. Was this, too, a language he had learned in war? This ability to provide comfort without words, to understand that sometimes presence matters more than speech. In the box was one more item I hadn't initially noticed, a small notebook with a water-stained cover. Inside, in my grandfather's handwriting, were lists of names and dates. Some had check marks beside them, others small notations. Called, letter sent, visited. The last entry was from just 3 weeks before he died, a name I didn't recognize, with the note, "Hospital took books." With a jolt of understanding, I realized what I was seeing. These were the names of other veterans, men from his unit perhaps, or others he had met after returning home. My silent grandfather, who never spoke of his war experiences, had been quietly checking on his comrades for decades, ensuring they weren't alone in their struggles. The silence that I had mistaken for distance suddenly revealed itself as something else entirely. A conscious choice to channel his energy into action rather than words, into future rather than past, into life rather than the shadow of death he had witnessed. I closed the notebook gently, beginning to understand the profound eloquence of what had gone unsaid. That evening, I sat on my grandfather's porch in his blue rocking chair, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of amber and gold. The wooden box rested in my lap, its contents now returned to their places. In the distance, children played in a neighbor's yard, their laughter carrying on the summer breeze. The same sounds that must have filled this street when my mother was young, when my grandfather was newly returned from a world away. I thought about the different kinds of courage it takes to live a life. There's the obvious bravery of combat that earns medals and citations. But there's also the quiet courage of choosing silence when speaking would only transfer pain to those you love. The steadfast courage of building a life focused on giving rather than taking, on creating rather than destroying. My grandfather's toolbox sat on the porch beside me, the one he had used to fix countless broken things in our family home. Inside were screwdrivers with handles worn smooth from decades of use, a tape measure with faded markings, pliers with springs that had long lost their tension. I realized that these tools, like his silence, were extensions of who he was, practical instruments of solution and healing. When I was 10, my bicycle chain had slipped off during a ride. Instead of simply fixing it for me, my grandfather had called me over, pointed to each tool I would need, and guided my hands through the repair process. Tools only work when you use them right, he had said, and sometimes the right tool isn't what you expect. Was his silence a tool as well, a carefully chosen instrument for building the life he wanted after war? I remembered how he would sit in this very chair most evenings, watching the neighborhood with attentive eyes. He knew when Mrs. Patterson, 2 doors down, started struggling with her trash cans after her arthritis worsened. He began taking them to the curb for her every Thursday without being asked. He noticed when the Lawrence boys started walking home alone after baseball practice. He arranged his own schedule to be working in the front yard during that time, offering a protective presence without fanfare. These weren't coincidences. They were conscious choices, the actions of a man who observed carefully and responded with deliberate kindness. A man who understood that sometimes the most meaningful things we do are the ones nobody notices or acknowledges. Inside the box, beneath the medals and photographs, I had found a small, smooth stone. At first, I thought it was out of place, just a pebble that had somehow slipped into this collection of meaningful artifacts. but its position suggested intention. And now, as twilight deepened, I held it in my palm, feeling its weight and texture. Had he carried this from Vietnam? Was it a touchstone, a physical reminder of something significant? Or was it simply what it appeared to be, an ordinary object given extraordinary meaning through personal association? I would never know for certain. Like so much about my grandfather, the stone's specific significance would remain unspoken. But perhaps that was the point. Perhaps the meaning we assign to things, to objects, to silence, to the spaces between words is itself a kind of language. As darkness settled over the neighborhood, I realized I was beginning to understand the lexicon of my grandfather's life. His silence wasn't a wall but a doorway, not emptiness but fullness, not absence but a different kind of presence. The war had taught him the limits of words, the inadequacy of language to capture certain truths. And so he had constructed a different vocabulary, one of actions, of steady presence, of unwavering reliability. I was finally learning to speak it. The following day, I continued sorting through my grandfather's belongings, now seeing each item through a different lens. His collection of history books, many focused on periods well before and after Vietnam, showed dog-eared pages and penciled notes in the margins. Evidence of a mind engaged with the broader context of conflict and peace, and not just his own experience. His workshop in the garage revealed meticulously maintained tools, each returned to its outlined place on the pegboard, a system of order imposed on a small corner of the world. I called my mother that evening, curious about perceptions I had never thought to question before. "Did Grandpa ever talk to you about Vietnam?" I asked after describing what I'd found. There was a pause on the line. "Not directly," she said finally, "but there were moments, usually when he thought I wasn't paying attention. Once, and when I was about 12, a documentary about the war came on television. He watched for a few minutes, then left the room. I found him in the backyard, just standing there looking at the stars. When I asked if he was okay, he put his arm around me and said, 'The worst thing about war isn't what it takes from you, but what it makes you take from others.'" She sighed. That was the closest he ever came to discussing it. But his service shaped everything about how he raised us. His insistence on gratitude for small things, the way he taught us to solve problems without complaint, his emphasis on leaving places and people better than we found them. After we hung up, I contacted my uncle, my grandfather's only son, who had followed him into military service but in the Air Force rather than the Marines. "Dad never tried to talk me out of enlisting," he told me. "But the night before I left for basic training, he sat me down and said something I've never forgotten. He said, 'Whatever you see or do in uniform, remember that your most important deployment is the one back to your family. Some wounds aren't visible, son. The deepest ones are the hardest to heal.'" These fragments, these brief departures from his customary silence, revealed a man who had thought deeply about his experiences, who had processed them internally and distilled them into wisdom he passed on not through stories but through carefully chosen moments of connection. As word spread through the small town that I was clearing out my grandfather's house, visitors began to appear. Mrs. Patterson came with a casserole and memories of how he had quietly cleared her walkway after every snowstorm for 20 years. The Lawrence boy, now a man with children of his own, stopped by to tell me how my grandfather had taught him to change a tire and check his oil before he got his driver's license. Most surprising was the visit from Pastor Williams, who had conducted my grandfather's funeral service. "Your grandfather never joined our church," he said, sitting at the kitchen table where my grandfather had eaten breakfast every morning. "But for 15 years, he was the first person I called whenever a veteran in town was struggling. He would visit them, not to talk necessarily, but to sit with them, to take them fishing, to help them with projects around their houses. He understood what they needed because he had been there himself. The pastor smiled gently. Some of the most powerful ministry happens without a single verse being quoted or prayer being spoken. Your grandfather knew that. He preached with his life more eloquently than many do from the pulpit. As each visitor shared their stories, a mosaic emerged of a man whose influence had radiated outward in quiet, consistent waves. My grandfather had never spoken of heroism, but he had lived it daily in ways I was only beginning to comprehend. The silence I had once mistaken for emotional distance now revealed itself as something far more profound, a deliberate choice to let his life speak for itself. On my final evening in my grandfather's house, I returned to the porch with a new understanding. The wooden rocking chair creaked familiarly as I settled in to watch what had been his favorite time of day, that transitional moment when day surrenders to night, when the world is painted in gold and shadow. In my lap was a leather-bound journal I had purchased in town that afternoon. On the first page I had written, "The things he never said, lessons from my grandfather's silence." It wasn't meant as a book or even as something others would read, simply a way to capture the understanding that was crystallizing within me. As the sun dipped lower toward the horizon, I thought about the nature of inheritance. We expect to receive objects from those who came before us: furniture, jewelry, photographs. We may even expect to inherit traits: his eyes, her smile, a certain temperament or talent. But my grandfather had left me something less tangible yet more valuable, a demonstration of how to move through the world with grace after witnessing its darkest aspects. The neighbor across the street emerged from his house to water his garden. A Vietnam veteran himself, younger than my grandfather had been, who had always greeted him with a solemn nod when they passed each other. I remembered how my grandfather would sometimes alter his walking route to pass by this man's house, when the neighbor's American flag was flying at half-mast, a silent acknowledgement of shared understanding. I jotted in the journal, "Respect doesn't always need words. Sometimes it's just showing up, bearing witness." The sun touched the edge of the distant hills, beginning its final descent. How many sunsets had my grandfather watched from this very spot? How many evenings had he sat here, perhaps finding in the reliable rhythm of day's end a counterbalance to the chaos he had experienced in war? I added another note. Healing isn't always about talking. Sometimes it's about finding moments of peace and protecting them fiercely. As twilight deepened, fireflies began to appear in the yard, pinpricks of light against the gathering darkness. My grandfather had taught me to catch them in cupped hands when I was small, to peek at their momentary glow, and always to release them gently. "Everything wants to be free," he had said. "Everything deserves its own light." I wrote, "The most important lessons come in the simplest packages." Darkness had nearly completed its transition when I noticed something I had overlooked before. Mounted discreetly beside the porch door was a small bronze plaque tarnished with age. I tilted it toward the last light to read the inscription, a quote attributed to Marcus Aurelius: "Waste no more time arguing what a good man should be. Be one." It struck me that this, perhaps more than anything else, encapsulated my grandfather's philosophy. He had not discussed the war because he had been too busy living its counterpoint, creating peace in his corner of the world, tending to the wounded around him, building rather than destroying. His silence hadn't been the absence of communication, but a different form of it altogether. He had spoken through consistency, through small kindnesses, through showing up when needed and standing back when appropriate. He had taught me not with lectures but with presence, the most elemental form of love. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, I closed the journal and placed my hand on the wooden armrest, where his hand had rested countless times before. The wood was smooth from years of contact, polished by the same fingers that had once held weapons in defense of country, that had later held fishing rods and wrenches in my small hand, crossing the street. In that moment of connection across time, I finally heard what his silence had been saying all along. 3 years have passed since I sat on my grandfather's porch that final evening. His house belongs to a young family now. Children play in the yard where he once meticulously tended his vegetable garden. New voices echo through rooms that once knew his quiet presence. The wooden box with his medals and dog tags sits on my own mantel, alongside the folded flag from his funeral and a framed photograph, not of him in uniform, but one I found showing him teaching me to bait a hook at age 7. His weathered hands guiding my smaller ones with infinite patience. I've come to understand that what my grandfather gave me through his silence was more valuable than any war story could have been. He showed me that healing doesn't always require words, that strength often manifests in gentleness, that the deepest forms of courage may go unrecognized and uncelebrated. Each Veterans Day, I visit his grave with fresh flowers, and each Memorial Day, I attend the ceremony at the local monument where his name is now engraved alongside others from our town. But my true tribute to him exists in how I've learned to listen differently, to hear what isn't being said, to recognize that silence can be a form of protection rather than rejection, to understand that some experiences transform us in ways that transcend language. My grandfather never spoke of the war, but he taught me everything I needed to know about its aftermath. How to carry invisible wounds with dignity, how to channel pain into purpose, and most importantly, how to ensure that what we've witnessed doesn't prevent us from fully experiencing what awaits. Sometimes I've learned the most profound lessons come wrapped in sentence, if only we have the patience to listen.